Hello, everyone. Amir very kindly asked me to make a presentation. I'm not sure in what capacity, other than his very proud colleague, and both at the Department of International Development and here in San Antonio, and also because it gives me the opportunity to welcome you to the college. Um, I think today we are celebrating two things in many ways. The first is the launch of this book, Survival of the Greenest, Economic Transformation in Climate Conscious World. And the second, in many ways, is Amir's first year in the department. It has been fantastic to have him with us. It has renewed discussions of political economy at the department and in the college. So I think we can use the opportunity to celebrate both the book and your arrival to Oxford, which we are very proud of. To do that celebration and to have an academic discussion about it, we have four great speakers who have made significant contributions in various political economy issues. First, Ann Pettifor, who is a political economist and director of Greenest. Godoy Rueda, who is Associate Director of Economic Justice at the Open Society Foundation, Richard Kozul-Wright, who is the former Director of Globalization and Development Strategies at UNTAC, and shaping a lot of debates on globalization when he was there, and Lee Harris, who is Moral Money Reporter at the Financial Times. We will first start with a presentation by Amir of the book, and then we will have this fantastic panel to discuss for around 14 minutes the various dimensions. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming, and congratulations for a fantastic accomplishment. And I think the floor is now to Veronica for some.
Thank you, Diego. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. Today. Just brief housekeeping. Amir will present for 30 minutes his book, but then we will pass for a conversation between all of us here. And of course, we'll have moments to raise questions from you. Because the objective of this is not only to celebrate and talk about Amir's great book, but to exchange ideas, how the development and the green agenda are connected or are not connected enough. How when we talk about green and climate, it's not only about green and climate, but so many other topics, justice, geopolitics. So yeah, and this is just an invitation to do this event as participatory as we can, because that's what makes a good event. So yeah, I think I don't have anything else to say so far. Thank you, Diego, for the wonderful introduction for everyone. And Amir, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Vero. And thank you, everyone, for coming. I'm very excited and happy to share this moment with you, and also for the discussion that we have with four very insightful people. So it's a very good occasion to speak about not only the book, but actually the future of the green economic transformation agenda, the obstacles ahead, and what we can collectively do. And hopefully it also it's useful in the discussion, inspires some of the students that I see in the room who are working on this very issue. So the title of the book is inspired from a quote from Charles Darwin, the famous British naturalist, who had written that it's not the most intellectual of the species that survives, not even the strongest, but the species that survives is the one that is able to best adapt and adjust to the changing environment in which it finds itself. And this is true of us as the human species, but it's also true for us as economists that have to adapt to changing circumstances, but also true of nations and development strategies that need to deal with the rapidly changing dynamics of structural transformation that are induced both by climate change and the global fight against it. And I think to talk about this need for adaptation and adjustment as a proactive stance, a very good example comes from that of a small island in the Pacific. I don't know if anyone recognizes this island of Nauru, which doesn't really strike you as a development success story, but it used to be one of the highest, it used to be one of the richest nations in the world in terms of income per capita in the 1970s, with over $27,000 of income per capita, right? This is a picture of the president in front of his Rolls Royce. And essentially, the island was so rich thanks to the extraction of its rich phosphate deposits. But the extraction of phosphate was done in an environmentally harmful way, which effectively destroyed the arable land, and therefore the means to sustain livelihoods, which used to be the important source of income for the previous centuries for local populations. And a few decades later, the inevitable happened, which is the island ran out of phosphate resources. It went back from being a high-income nation to being a low-income nation. And now the reason why some of you may hear about Nauru in the news is that it's used to, the main source of income for the government is that they're using the island to host a refugee detention center on behalf of Australia. And this is essentially as much as it gets in terms of horror story of economic development. But the reason why I bring this up is because this is a cautionary tale. This is something that can still happen to many countries around the world that depend on the extraction of non-renewable resources. There's also a case that shows that present decisions completely condition future production possibilities, and that the environmental agenda is not only of ecological concerns, but also it's a matter of time horizon, right, for prosperity. And this is why the objective of the book was to debunk some of the myths that exist around the green or the climate and development agenda. There's often this picture that, climate and development is, all good, it's reconciled. If it's green, it's clean, it's lean, it's all good. But the book tried to address some of the issues and perhaps add a bit of pessimistic note to the discussion. So the first myth is the idea that global decarbonization stands to benefit everyone and facilitate green industrialization, right, by providing this new window of opportunity. When the reality is a lot more complex. So on one hand, it's true that sustainability brings about new opportunities for economic transformation. So in comparison to the intense competition that already exists for standard industrialization, so the large-scale deployment of renewable energy, so opens up these kind of new doors for industrialization. There's also the link with the so-called fourth industrial revolution and the advent of cyber-physical industrial systems, so things like big data, artificial intelligence, clouding services. These are highly energy-intensive services, which then the carbon footprint of the ICT sector is larger than that of aviation, right? So looking ahead, the ability to access clean, reliable, cheap energy sources are key to access the state-of-the-art industrialization. And there's also this notion of environmental upgrading. So the idea of adding value to your products and industries by adopting environmental measures, right? By increasing your resource and material efficiency. So essentially, that's a new way of generating value and prosperity. And that's all true. However, what we see, especially over the past 3-4 years, is that those opportunities are becoming increasingly consolidated and captured by a handful of already industrialized nations, which begs the question of, well, there are green windows of opportunity, but actually most of those green windows of opportunities are already shut, right? So which ones remain? From these new opportunities for green economic transformation, you'll notice that at least 2 of the 3 heavily rely on access to renewable energy, right? But when you think of where are investments in renewables going, I have a question for you. So over the past few years, if you put it in per capita terms, the amount of investments in renewables amount to about $180 per capita for the US and Canada, about 140 for Japan, for Europe. What do you think is the amount for sub-Saharan Africa? Take wild guesses. No wrong answers. My students who already know the statistics are not allowed to answer. So what do you think? True? Very, very close.
Zero.
It's $1 per capita, right, of investment in renewables in sub-Saharan Africa, compared to 180 for the US and Canada, 140 for Japan. And this is considering the fact that the bulk of the world population that still doesn't have access to electricity is, so about 600 million people, is in sub-Saharan Africa. So this is where you have the highest need, but it's also where you have very high potential. We all know that, there are fantastic conditions for low-cost solar, wind, geothermal energy production in Africa. So the money is clearly not flowing where it would be the most useful for global development. And this pattern, you see it across different dimensions of green economic transformation. When you look at jobs, you see that most of the jobs around renewables are actually concentrated in a handful of countries, right? Especially China, Europe, USA, Brazil and India as well to some extent. But then there's also a difference, and most of those jobs are not created in areas where you'll have the highest loss of jobs in fossil fuels. Even though there might be a net job creation worldwide, these jobs won't be created and lost in the same places. And this is just talking about the volume of jobs, right? If you look at the quality of jobs, they differ tremendously between countries like Brazil and India versus Europe, US, and China. This is work that Catherine Hoshetler at the LSE has done, showing that most of the jobs in Brazil around renewables tend to be low-paid, low-skilled, temporary, mostly in sugar plantations for ethanol production or in construction maintenance of solar plants. And it's very different from the jobs created in manufacturing and innovation activities in the global north. That same pattern, you see it in terms of export markets of low-carbon technology products. 3 countries, namely China, Germany, and the US, account for half of global low-carbon technology exports. And this is something that you see is still happening with the fantastic rise of China on that dimension over the past 20 years. So as things stand, these kind of new green windows of opportunities are not going to be captured by latecomers, and it jeopardizes the central promise of the UN Sustainable Development Goals of leaving no one behind. And at the same time, most developing countries are stuck in the exact same role as the past, which is as providers of raw materials needed to fuel the global energy transition, with all the environmental problems that it causes, but also the economic problems. And from the large literature, from Latin American structuralism, we learn all the issues that are associated with this kind of trade, technological, and commodity dependencies. So essentially, developing countries are punished 3 times. 1, because they're disproportionately impacted by climate risks. And this is notably because of their dependence on commodities, on agro-commodities, which are particularly vulnerable to fluctuations in temperature and precipitation. Then they're punished another time because credit rating agencies are increasingly taking into account those climate and transition risks in their ratings, which means that for these countries, it's becoming more and more costly to borrow, right? And there are studies showing that in the future, for every $10 paid in interest rate, another dollar will be paid because of climate risks from developing countries. And third, they're also pushed out from the new diversification opportunities arising from global decarbonization. So this map shows the kind of revealed comparative advantage in low carbon technology products, and it becomes very clear, right, that if you accept existing comparative advantages as a given, then global development will just not happen. And this is why it's important not to, to defy, right, the notion of comparative advantage, and building on the very large tradition, especially here in Oxford with the work by Sanjay Alal, the late Sanjay Alal, by now Xiaolan and others, on how countries actually acquired new technological capabilities, right? There's nothing that makes the Danes better at producing wind turbines than the others. But it requires rethinking the role of the state. And this is why the second myth that the book addresses is the myth that market-based solutions suffice to fight climate change and poverty. So this is one of the most persistent myths, notably because of the legitimacy given by including a Nobel laureate, Nordhaus, who said that raising the price of carbon is a necessary and sufficient step to solve global warming. The rest is largely fluff. And in practice, market-based solutions are useful, but they are far from sufficient, not only to address climate change, but making sure to address poverty as well. Which is why the main argument of the book is that governments should not just be referees, right, that set the rules of the game or change the rules of the game, but could also be the head coach that sets the vision of the strategy, the training capabilities that enables the players, aka the firms, to increase their chemistry between them, their competitiveness, and essentially have a chance to compete in the international competition for industrialization. I like Zidane because, maybe there are some Barcelona fans that don't want to see his face. But what is interesting about him is his successes not only as a player, but also on the other side of the pitch, right? And it shows that you don't have to be the captain to influence the result of the game. The analogy also goes into showing the learning by doing that happens, right? Even for governments designing their industrial policies, but also the time that it takes. And I understand that Richard is an Arsenal fan. So first of all, sorry for your pain, Richard. But a few years ago, if I remember correctly, Arsenal was performing very poorly at the beginning of the season, and then had this kind of insane comeback towards the second half of the Premier League. But actually, it also shows that you need to give time, right, for governments to explain. It's not at the first mistake that industrial policy needs to be shut down, but sometimes it takes time to achieve this learning by doing.
A long time,
Maybe one day you'll manage. So, in terms of what this head coach role implies, well, I just mentioned the money is not flowing where it's the most needed and most useful. And there's a lot that can be done at the domestic level in terms of mobilizing the right type of development finance for green transformation, which requires long-term funding. And this is something that the domestic private banking sector often fails to provide because of a risk aversion. Very often, especially in African countries, there's been the kind of fiscal stabilization funds have become extremely popular as a way to mobilize commodity financing and promote long-term development. But in fact, with Tony Addison, we've done some work looking at the impact that they've had over the past 20 years. And a lot of them have now completely melted without much tangible impact because even though they're useful, they have a very high opportunity cost when those resources are only used to invest in foreign assets overseas and they're not really made available for domestic development. And if you don't address the root causes of commodity dependence, then when you have a shock, it becomes the same story again. And we see it in many countries, Nigeria, Algeria, where when commodity prices went down, they've just withdrawn those money, which enabled short-term stabilization, but long-term development was still not stimulated. National development banks then have a key role to play right? They have this long-term mandate. They can provide funding where private investment is not flowing. They can reduce risks because they have credit ratings, so they can invest jointly with other actors. But the point here is that all these different institutions need to work together in a virtuous circle of policy interactions, and even central banks should be involved in that discussion beyond their traditional macroprudential mandate. Because if it's about long-term transformation, if it's a real risk to macroeconomic stability, then central banks should have a more proactive mandate to allocate resources to national development banks, to priority sectors, and ensuring long-term resilience. But this requires financial coordination as well as foresight. And obviously, the elephant in the room is industrial policy, which used to be a very taboo topic. It used to put a lot of people off because of mistakes made in the past. But the whole question is how to do industrial policy right. And it's interesting to also have this panel, and Lee, you've written about green protectionism, because the one thing that really enabled to burst that bubble was the fact that the United States is now openly acknowledging that they are using an industrial policy. And the one issue, however, so the book looks at the political economy dimension, the distributional effect, but two points that I wanted to raise here for discussion is the issue of the coordination of green industrial policy. Because in the literature, industrial policy was always the domain of the very powerful Ministry of International Trade and Industry in many countries. But with green industrial policy, this is very difficult, right? Because you cannot have a green industrial policy pushed by the Ministry of Industry, where the Ministry of Energy is pursuing something very different, and the Ministry of Environment as well. So in terms of policy coherence, it's interesting to see how different countries have found their own ways of dealing, right, with that coordination. So in Malaysia, this has been the role of the Economic Planning Unit, right, which sits with the Prime Minister's office, oversees the design of policies across ministries, but also the follow-up and the implementation. In China, they've taken a radical decision, which was the elimination of the Ministry of Energy, because they realized that energy is a cross-ministerial issue, and it didn't make sense to keep it in only one ministry. So instead, they have a national commission of energy that actually brings together different stakeholders. I'm not saying that this is a solution for many countries, but it's interesting to see this process of institutional learning, right? And actually finding the solution that works in that specific context. In Brazil, and I put it for discussion, I see some Brazilians in the room, there seems to be 5 different types of green industrial policy promoted by 5 different ministries. And it's interesting to see where the ministerial confusion actually comes in. So this is the coordination within countries, but there's also the issue of coordination amongst countries. So for many countries, actually, I don't know if I have those slides. If not, then that's all right. And for many, so when you talk about green industrial policy, very often the successful cases are very large economies with very large domestic markets, right? China, the United States, the EU as a region, even in the global south, Brazil, India. But what about the smaller economies? What about Guatemala, Togo? And there, the interesting thing is the kind of regional dimension and the coordination that needs to happen within countries to leverage complementary assets. And this really reframes the kind of challenge of industrial policy in those nations and how to actually achieve a multilateral coordination of green industrialization strategies. The very last myth is the idea that green economic transformation is mostly about producing low carbon tech like solar panels or wind turbines. So this is also what comes to most people's mind when you think about green industries or green industrialization. But the issue here is that this might not be viable for most countries, right, attempting green economic transformation. And in fact, the countries that are already producing those goods are making it very difficult for newcomers to pursue the same strategies, right? So essentially, even those routes to industrialization are becoming increasingly clogged, if you want to put it in a neutral way, Or to be more cynical, there are a lot of intentional hurdles left in the way. And this is why Hajun Chang's work on kicking away the ladder is ever so relevant, right? This was written 20 years ago. And today you see the same process of kicking away the green ladder. And you see it in many, many different ways. So that's another question that I wanted to ask you. Can you raise your hand if you think that bicycles are an environmental good? So a climate-friendly product. So almost everybody, right? Can you raise your hand if you don't think that they're an environmentally friendly product? Okay, nobody, one. So essentially, most of us would agree. The European Union would disagree with you, because for them, and this was one of the key points of tension in the environmental goods agreement at the WTO, they refused to consider bicycles as an environmental good, because if they did, they would have had to remove tariffs on the import of bicycles, and this would have completely wiped out the European bicycle industry, because basically bikes from China are not only much better but much cheaper. And this was one of the key elements that led to the breakdown of the negotiations of the agreement, because for China it was simple hypocrisy, right? The whole point was to remove tariffs on goods that can help us deliver on fighting climate change. And if you start to cherry pick, right, based on your industrial interests, then there's no point having the agreement in the first place. And this is one of the many, many, many ways in which some nations, especially the EU, have over the last 60, 70 years used different types of regulations, especially environmental regulations, as a de facto import constraint, right? Based on the goods that they wanted to promote domestically. And today you see it as well with the European carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is kind of portrayed as a climate action. But the whole point is, why only those 6 sectors and not others, right? And these are also sectors where the European Union is heavily investing to develop domestic capabilities. Part of kicking away the ladder was also failing to achieve the promises of climate financing. The country that have failed the most for its quota was the United States. So it has been missing about $40 billion per year. It may seem like a large number, but just to put things into perspective, the US government has spent over $1 trillion on this fighter jets that you see over there, which is the least used weapon in military history, right? So $40 billion doesn't really seem like, the key binding constraint for the US government. And this is quite important because for many countries that are attempting to use the same strategies, essentially the routes to entry are completely blocked. This is why it's important to avoid the kind of imitating green industrial policies that work somewhere and going beyond isomorphic mimicry. So just repeating what works somewhere and reproducing those conditions. And green industrial policy is really not just about manufacturing low carbon goods. Countries need to look at their starting points, their context, and identify where is their potential competitive edge. So, and the challenge of ecology is also not just about the carbon footprint, right? This is one side of the story, but there's many other challenges that exist: material pollution, overuse of renewable resources like water, but also biodiversity protection. Since speaking of that, one of the different contexts that is addressed on the book is that of biodiverse nations, right? And what does economic transformation looks like in those areas? So right here, you can see this hummingbird moving. How many of you have had the chance to observe a hummingbird from close? Quite a few. What is the main thing that strikes you when looking at a hummingbird?
The wings.
The wings. What about the wings?
They move. It's a fantastic, and the stability of the body while the wings are moving.
Yeah, Precisely. So the exoskeleton of the hummingbird gives it abilities that even the latest grade of human-made drones cannot do, right? So the ability to move in 4 different directions, the complete stability of the head, right? And this is one of the examples that nature has 3.4 billion years of R&D, right? That we can actually learn from for innovation. And this is actually precisely what the Japanese scientists did for the development of the bullet trains, where they had an engineering problem coming out of tunnels. So they actually shaped the front of the train after the beak of the kingfisher because of its aerodynamic features. And this is how they solved the kind of the problem that they had with the sound barrier. The US Department of Defense is also increasingly doing so because nature is not only more sustainable, but nature also kills. So they've investing billions of dollars into R&D for actually designing drones after hummingbirds so that they can move in 4 different directions, and bees in terms of what we can learn from how they communicate for computational strategies and whatnot. But the point here is how to use it for sustainable development. And what those examples shows that biodiversity not only has this ecological value, but also has a key value as a source of information and inspiration for development, right? The problem is, well, most of the world's biodiversity is in the global south, but most of the successful capture of this innovation value is by firms in the United States, in Europe, in Japan, in South Korea, increasingly. And there is a kind of, how to say, a northern exploitation of southern biodiversity, right, when it comes to using the informational value of biodiversity. And in biodiverse areas, so especially in Latin America, there have been some interesting successes, some failures, but there's still major obstacles that exist in this agenda. One of it is limited bioprospecting to date, so limited mapping of genetic material and natural assets, lack of critical mass of specialized human capital due to a lack of interdisciplinary university training related to bioinnovation. So for biomimicry, you don't just need biological training, but you also need to mix it with engineering, design, chemistry, and it's having this kind of interdisciplinary training that gives the ability to identify solutions in nature, but also inadequate financial support. And when you look at most of the finance for biodiversity that exists, it's mostly with a highly rentier model, right? So it's just giving money for conserving the natural assets or payments for ecosystem services, but not actually funding for developing this kind of solutions that combine productive development with conservation. And it's almost as if it's about protecting the tree, but not so much the communities that live in those areas. So my last question, I promise. How many people do you think live in the Amazon region? Yeah, but you're Brazilian. That's cheating. So there is a complete, when I usually ask this question, you get answers ranging from 10,000 to 100,000, and sometimes the people who know who go into the million. But essentially, if you look at the type of biodiversity finance towards the Amazon, is as if no one lived in the Amazon, right? And these people need the means to sustain their livelihoods. So the rentier model of biodiversity needs to be broken down. Very last, the takeaways. So the conditions of economic development are changing. And that means that going green is not just an ecological act, but also an act of macroeconomic resilience. And that's also for developing countries that have a legitimate right to extract their fossil fuels or the right to pollute. And that brings the question is, even if you have that right, is it still the optimal strategy for your country in the long term? So going back to the Nauru case. The second one is long-run macroeconomic resilience to climate change goes beyond short-term fiscal stabilization tools. And this is why adapting industrial policy is key to the current context of a green industrialization race. So as I mentioned earlier, it's great that we have for the discussion lead that's been working on green protectionism, and I'm particularly curious about what it means for how could the United States have a responsible, a globally responsible industrial policy, right? And the work that Anne has done on the Green New Deal before everyone else, right? Way ahead of the curve. So I think we're particularly curious to see how the discussion has changed since you started to think about it over 15 years ago. And finally, the presentation was mostly about the kind of domestic level policies and politics, but there's a limit to what governments can do without a reform of the global financial and trade systems, which are not fair, and they're not leveling the playing field for latecomers. So this is why it's very nice to also count on Richard, who's been at the heart of multilateralism for many years, and I'm sure has many thoughts on the issues and opportunities that exist. And Luis, who've been doing a lot of work, not only in Mexico, in the ministry when he was at the Ministry of Economy, but now at Open Society Foundations, thinking about how to make the world fair in terms of green industrial policies for developing countries. So on that note, thank you very much for your attention. Thank you for being here, and I really look forward to the discussion. And by the way, the book is completely free to download, which means that if you read it, and it's very short, 100 pages. So if you read it and you don't like it, you won't have wasted money and you won't have wasted much time, right? So, and that's the most valuable.
Thank you, Amir. And just to add up, if there's something that you don't like or you have comments, we're also a dynamic, active work in progress. So we are happy to receive all of your input. And I think this is also a good space to share that. So I think just to share the floor with our great panelists here. Any first reflections, first ideas? Anyone wants to volunteer or? Okay, Luis? Leave. Okay.
Gosh, or if you absolutely fabulous talk, Amir. Thank you so much for having me, and I really enjoyed the book. And you packed a whole lot into 100 pages. But let me think where to begin with my reflections. I mean, so one of my favorite points in the book was this framework of was this sort of warning Amir has against what he calls isomorphic mimicry, and trying to implement industrial policies that have gone well for other countries. I think one example you give is local content requirements worked really well for China. That doesn't mean they work well everywhere. And I liked it because, there's no single kind of playbook of what industrial policy looks like. One worry I have, and I guess question I want to put to the panel is that kind of healthy pluralism about industrial policy and fitting it to various different institutions. The risk I worry is then we're just saying, do the good kind of industrial policy, not the bad kind, or make sure you have, competent bureaucrats or politicians rather than incompetent ones. And so maybe I hope we'll, in the course of discussion, have examples that bring out a little bit of what's been successful. I also wanted to talk a bit about jobs. I had been, until recently, kind of covering the US energy transition, and maybe I could talk about what these problems look like in the country that more than any other is pulling up the green ladder and has the most resources at its disposal to do this in ways that in theory kind of maximize benefits for workers, communities, and maximize the ability of to make this both politically attractive to Americans and good for the environment. Because I think even there, even in the sort of hegemon that has all the power and resources at its disposal, it's kind of a mixed picture how good this has actually been so far for workers. So in particular, I think in a number of industries, right, the US is trying to, has subsidized the creation of jobs in the EV sector, in solar and wind, and a number of these like more manufacturing heavy industries and at much greater expense than just importing them from China. And while there's been a lot of talk about a resurgence of the labor movement, we haven't actually yet seen those union organizing numbers tick up, though that could yet come. And I also think there's a very mixed picture on whether green jobs will actually create more jobs, or whether partly because it's this kind of green sectors are more modern and often more recent technologies can be produced with more robotics, whether it actually is a net loss for overall employment, which is all to say, to Amir's point, that green industrial policy means looking beyond exclusively manufacturing and to other kinds of sectors. And so I hope a couple examples of that, let me see, from the book that I had taken down are, you had an interesting discussion of agriculture and kind of sectors beyond traditional manufacturing where green jobs could be really important. A piece of the U.S. industrial policy suite of bills that kind of fell out and never was implemented was like the kind of care economy piece. So there had been an effort. I think this was maybe kind of bad branding, but the campaigners who worked on this sort of argued that care is infrastructure, and they were trying to fit like higher teachers' salaries and nursing and a number of sectors that aren't obviously like green sectors into this big package of public spending. That got dropped out. But I think that the point is, those are all low carbon jobs that are underfunded, and so I'd love to talk about services, because you make the point in the book that, kind of trying to leapfrog straight into services, even, higher paid business services, typically that hasn't been as good of a strategy as developing kind of an economically complex manufacturing base and then building services on top of that, which I think is an interesting kind of live debate with Danny Roderick and others who have had interesting recently changed their minds, it seems. And I guess, yeah, to summarize the jobs point, it would be, okay, clearly we need a lot more green manufacturing. It's a strategy that looks like it's going to do a good job decarbonizing rich countries. Can it really create as many jobs or as good quality of jobs as it's promising to? And if not, what's the kind of strategy to make the energy transition more politically palatable, both in the core and in the periphery, for whom this is obviously 100 times harder? Let's see. You also raise the wicked problem of higher borrowing costs for poor countries. And I think in the book, you sort of say, well, multilateral lending's insufficient, issuing green bonds, that's nice, but it's not going to be sufficient. And I wonder if you have recommendations there, what to do with that impossible issue. Maybe I'll stop there for now.
Shall I continue?
Yeah,
then?
please.
Okay. Thank you, Amir. First of all, congratulate you, Vero, the team for the event and for finally presenting this. It's great work, and I got to start saying that before it was printed, it was already influencing debates around the world, and we actually had a presentation in Mexico of this book at Colegio de Mexico, and it was already starting a conversation. So congratulate you for that.
Don't tell them that there was a book launch before this one.
No, it was just sharing some ideas, which is actually the important part of your work, and it's already, as I said, influencing some debates, even from the perspective of open societies already. It was quite helpful to have your book and your ideas because we're launching a new program on economic and climate prosperity, and it was already useful for us, and I'm pretty sure I can say also for other colleagues that thank you because of your work and because of the ideas that you have shared. And what I say is this new set of generation of green industrial policies. Just briefly, the first thing that I think is relevant is that this book that is, as you said, short, and you can read it quite easily and enjoyable. It's it's useful for policy making. And this is from, of course, my perspective and my bias of working before at the government. Um, and it's useful because it goes straight to the question of state capacity, which is a big question when we talk about implementing green industrial policies, especially in the global south. How can we help countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Mexico, Brazil that they have problems institutionally speaking, of course, to develop and to balance a little bit this new generation of industrial policies push from the north, from US, from the European Union, from Japan, from China. And as you said, as we saw, the big question of head coach, captain, or referee, it is useful to answer that question, to basically connect the green industrial policy agenda with policymakers around the world. So yeah, congratulate you, because it's already been used in a way. I've been sharing the last few years, maybe months, with Amir, and if you follow him on social media, you'll see that he travels a lot, and he's like, we're doing a huge advocacy work in the multilateral arena, but also on the national arena around countries like Mexico, Colombia, Brazil. And I gotta say that this set of ideas is already been useful for some of the national debates. The second big contribution I think this book has, and it will have in the following, hopefully, months and years, is in terms of communicating green industrial policy. There's a lot of misunderstandings around the world when we talk about green industrial policy. Of course, there's first the idea that green industrial policy is green protectionism. And again, Amir immediately answers that by saying, no, multilateralism is possible on this new set of this new green industrial policy agenda. It's hard, of course, it's not easy, but we need to basically embrace multilateralism on green industrial policy. And secondly, there's, of course, the stigma that we all know here in the UK, but I mean, if we talk about industrial policy, and we know this in Latin America, for instance, if you think there's a stigma here, over there, it's a huge stigma. Like industrial policy, it's a taboo, and you cannot name it basically in some spaces, and still in some governments, even progressive governments. So the book also, I think, it's quite relevant into communicating the myths that already Amir talked about them. Industrial policy is now and increasingly a necessity, and we're seeing that in some countries in Latin America where I mainly work. Finally, and just briefly, I gotta say that this book is already also creating sort of a community, and a community of practice around the world, and I think it's quite interesting to see the people around it. I've seen Amir presenting these ideas for different stakeholders, and what I'm constantly thinking is how important it is to have this conversation, this community, on truly not a new topic, because this is not necessarily the industrial policy already had a community, but Amir work now, I think, will be quite relevant for this, what I think is a new ecosystem of global green industrial policy. And I mean, survival of the greenest is just an example of this community. And yeah, congratulate you for bringing us on this discussion. And I'll happily engage more with the big policy questions related to this new green economic transformation that we are living. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Liz. Speaking of global green industrial policy,
Right.
I'm particularly curious to hear your thoughts about how this all has been changing over the past 15 years.
It's difficult to know where to start, but I have to start by saying that I congratulate you on this book. Thank you for including me here. And what I feel is, and what I know from having worked in Africa, in Malawi, in Nigeria, I helped Nigeria clear about $30 billion of debt. And being a South African-born person and spending a lot of time there, I'm picturing, policymakers, politicians, officials trying to tackle this huge issue of climate breakdown and not having the resources. And I can just see how useful this book is, for them. So I thank you for it. And I thank you also for the way in which you've approached these issues, which I think is very progressive. I think you've been very skillful. You've sort of snaked your way through the whole question of growth and degrowth and so on. And you've managed to do this in a way not to offend too many people. And I think Richard and I shared this view before we started. We think you're a little bit too polite about all of these things. Right? But aside from that, it's a wonderful resource. And as Louis says, this people will be just grateful for the discussion, never mind for the real content that's in here. From my perspective, I think I need to tell you I'm doing several things at the moment. One of the things I'm doing, I'm a member of the Scottish Government's Just Transition Commission, right? And so in pursuit of this just transition, we've just been up to Shetland, where Shetland has more energy resources than you can dream of. They have tidal energy, they have wind energy on the most extraordinary scale. It's the windiest place in the world. They have oil and they have gas, right? And so on. And at the moment, they really hate what's happening, right? The island is covered in concrete because to just simply erect a turbine, you've got to build roads that on top of peat. And to build roads on top of peat, you've got to put down a load of concrete and destroy the peat in the process. And by destroying the peat, you're increasing carbon emissions and so on. And then there's vast turbines cover a big section of the island. And what are the benefits for the local people? Well, there are no jobs. There are going to be 27 jobs when they've established this massive turbine sector. And what's going to happen to the price of energy on that island? It's a cold, miserable, wet and windy island in the winter, right? They need warmth. And they pay the same price for their energy as someone living in London or someone living in Kent, because price of energy is determined, the market is complex, but it's determined by the price of gas, as you know, ultimately. So the price of green energy can be very, very high, as it's been in this last period. So, when we were on one Scottish island, people said to us, I've got these damn great turbines at the bottom of my garden, but I'm paying £5,000 a year in energy costs, right? And I live in a very drafty, cold house. I can't do anything more, blah. So there are real problems with the whole industrialization of green energy in the north, never mind the south. If we now move south to a country like Malawi, I then want to just talk about my favorite subject, which is how these things are financed. So Malawi does not have its own monetary system. Malawi is entirely dependent on foreigners for money. It relies essentially on US monetary policy for the amount for borrowing, essentially. It has to borrow money to invest. Right? Now, Britain doesn't have to borrow in a real sense money to invest, or if she does, she can do so on terms that suit the British government really effectively. And we won't go into that too much. But Malawi doesn't have an independent central bank. She doesn't have a tax collection system that is well managed and regulated. She doesn't have a proper accounting system for keeping the liabilities and assets in order and so on. There's so much that's missing. And the World Bank and the IMF have been dedicated to saying to Malawi, there's no need for you to build public capacity in the monetary system. You can always borrow dollars from the IMF or the World Bank, right? And so Malawi is in that dependency. So for me, the real issue about survival of the Greenest is how we can give governments policy autonomy so that actually they can look after the interests of their people, that they can actually be there to protect the security, the future security of their own citizens. But the current international financial system disempowers government. So they may want to do all these good things, and they will be stymied in that by the international system. And part of my worry about this book is that it discusses all of these within the context of this system, which penalizes countries, right? And actually makes it very hard for them to do anything other than play this role of dependency. So I just think that we need to, and I just wanted to come back to a point that Lee was making, which is that much as I like what you're saying about manufacturing, and much as I don't want to underestimate the importance of manufacturing, but in Scotland, we're arguing that actually what Scotland has to do is to restructure its economy away from its dependence on oil and gas. I need to tell you that the Commission has members of the Commission, representatives of working men that work on those gas rigs and that earn fortunes. So when we discuss with them the possibility of restructuring the Scottish economy and to build social infrastructure, and we say there's loads of capacity for what we call care, but it's about, childcare, it's about the care of the elderly, it's about health, it's about education, it's about the arts, it's about the sciences. These are all services that actually are low emitting forms of activity, but very high densely employment forms of activity. And when we do that, we get from the oil rig workers, you want me to go and work in a nursing home for a tenth of what I'm earning today. That's what you're trying to do to me. No, we say, we've got to raise the pay of people working in nursing homes to the level that you're earning, because that's a highly skilled job. Anyway, we're losing that argument. But what we haven't talked about enough, it seems to me, Amir, is how we can actually be doing things in low-income countries, which need to be done, include education, includes care, in investing in that. And somehow or other, that gets left off the table or seen as something soft or something not. When actually, to quote Charles Darwin, to adapt and to adjust to what's happening to us as a species, we're going to have to learn to do more of those things and less of the carbon emitting stuff. I'm not sure I've been very helpful, but just as a comment.
No, that's great. Thank you.
Which is the expert on industrial policy, so I'm bow to you.
Not really. Let me just endorse what my fellow panelists have said about the book, which it's very topical, it's very clear, it's short and it's free, which is a very attractive combination of virtues when it comes to writing books. So congratulations for achieving that, Amir. The central thesis of the book, which is one that is very close to where I was working for 30 years, essentially is that you can't solve the climate crisis independently of a whole series of long-standing development challenges that still have to be met. The book, of course, is about developing countries, but in many respects, and this is something that needs to be done, it speaks to problems in developed countries too. This country is rapidly becoming a developing country. But many of the problems that you talk about, I think, speak directly to the issues that a country like the UK has to face up to if it's going to meet both the economic goals of its citizens and the climate goals of the global community. I guess I have a slight irritation with the title. Survival of the fittest was not a Darwinian phrase, as you know. It was Herbert Spencer who coined that. Spencer was hardly a progressive guy. He was actually a pretty reactionary guy. And the problem is that the climate challenge is not really just an adaptation problem. As your subtitle rightly points out, it's a transformation that is really at the heart of meeting these two challenges. And I'm not sure Darwinian terminology. I'm not a natural scientist, so I better be careful how I phrase this. My recollection from my misspent youth on reading people like Stephen Jay Gould was that Darwin, in many respects, in terms of the social sciences was too close to Adam Smith and too far away from Marx, in the sense that his notion of adaptation was very individualist, it was very gradual, and that is not the kind of framework for thinking about the climate and development challenges, which are systemic, and there's a real urgency, obviously, to meeting them. So I have a kind of slight quibble, Amir, with that notion of using Spencer to frame the challenge. I mean, what is clear from the book, of course, is that the transformation is multidimensional. That's the point that comes out very strongly from what you say. It's not just about decarbonization. Even from a narrow economic point of view, it's about dematerialization, diversification of economic activity that we have to kind of focus in on. In that context, and Anne was very diplomatic. I've left the UN, so I don't have to be as diplomatic as I used to be. Developing countries will not sacrifice development and growth to meet the climate ambitions of other countries. That comes out, if anyone has been involved with the COP process, that comes out incredibly strongly. And the North needs to understand that and adapt to that reality, because for many developing countries who are still trying to fill the huge energy gap that their citizens face, to increase their living standards, to get basic education, transportation, health facilities in place, to some extent they don't see it as a priority. For some developing countries, because climate is already adversely affecting their economic prospects, the adaptation challenge is of course more important than the mitigation challenge, and they've become very angry in the COP context of the neglect of adaptation. That is how we deal with shocks that are already hitting developing countries, and rightly so, because the North doesn't want to really talk about this. They want to talk about mitigation goals. That's all they want to talk about. They don't want to talk about common but differentiated responsibilities. They just simply want to talk about everyone being in the same boat. And developing countries don't want to hear this kind of language. They want to hear that the advanced economies who have benefited from and been the main source of this problem need to take on much greater responsibilities. I think that comes out from the book, but it is a little bit hidden. But it does raise the question of what we think about degrowth as a way of framing the climate and development challenge. I think there's a discussion to be had on that, and I'd be curious to know what you all think about that issue. In terms of the industrial, I guess we've always been a little bit manufacturing fundamentalists in UNCTAD. I have to say that. And I'm not convinced by a lot of the arguments of people like Danny Roderick and others, partly because the service, it's never been absent from the industrial policy debate. Services used to be embedded in industrial firms. What's happened over the last 50 years is that many of those services, and their high quality services, have been liberated from their old structures and become standalone activities. But I think for many developing countries, obviously size matters here, but for many developing countries, manufacturing remains a fundamental challenge that they have to get right. They can't, of course, get it right in the way that advanced economies got it right over the last 150 years, because that would be disruptive to the planet. But manufacturing, I think, remains a very important part of the story. And therefore industrial policy matters in that context. I would say that, at least for us in the work that we've always done in UNCTAD, industrial policy is very difficult to separate from investment policy. And investment is, the climate challenges and the sustainable development goals ultimately are the biggest investment drive that is needed historically. You can't deliver any of these goals, whether they're ecological or social or economic, without a significant uptake in investment. And that's a real challenge, not only for developing countries, and the constraints on developing countries to raise their investment levels remain extremely serious. It's a problem for advanced economies too. I mean, the advanced economies are not investing at the same rate that they were in the bad old Keynesian days of the 1950s and 60s. That is, investment rates in a country like Britain are 5 or 6 percentage points lower than they were back then. And so we need to raise investment. And it's not there's a kind of pessimism about that somehow the world has changed so fundamentally that we can't do that. But clearly in my lifetime, and in many of our lifetime, the older generation here, investment policy was a critical part of a healthy economic environment. I think, as Amir rightly points out, it's not we need this kind of what you call a whole of society approach to this. I mean, it's about a whole set of policies that have to be integrated, and just singling one or two out and saying, have we done this well or not so well, I think misses the point about the need for an integrated strategy that comes out, I think, from the book. And as you say, raises the question, and I'll throw it out again. I think you fall on the kind of side of Daniela Gabor with the big green developmental state, and we would certainly, that would be our position in UNCTAD. You raise a lot of issues around that, particularly about, and I think it's the big issue, how a big green developmental state disciplines capital. Because I think one of the great challenges we've come to face in a highly financialized, highly open global economy is that capital's power comes from being able to move rapidly from one place to the other. It's a real asymmetry in the global economy that labor or domestic politicians struggle to come to terms with. And that need to be able to not just incentivize, and this is where I have my worries about Biden and the IRA, the ability to incentivize, which is an important part of industrial policy, as it clearly has been in the Biden administration, is not likely to work unless you also have a capacity to discipline the recipients of those rents and rewards. And I'm not convinced that the US has the developmental state in place at the moment to actually benefit from some of the good things that the Biden administration is clearly doing. I guess in that context, I would say we don't just need to talk about coordination, which you do and rightly in the book. And given that we need to talk about planning. I mean, industrial policy has been a dirty word for a long time. It's come back in. You're part of that revival, I think, Amir. The notion of planning continues to upset people, I think, and not necessarily for bad reasons. I mean, we know that certain types of planning have been disastrous for economic development. But I think I find it very difficult to think about these kind of this massive integrated challenge without thinking about planning. And what does that mean in the 21st century? And what kind of institutions do we need in place to be able to do it effectively and cognizant of the differences across countries? So that's an issue I think that hasn't received enough attention. Finally, on the international, I think Ann's right. The international system remains highly stratified, in which developing countries continue to have a subordinate position in the structures. And the danger of a lot of the policies that are advocated at the international level, in the COP space, in the Washington space, in the Geneva space, with respect to trade, tend to reproduce that position of subordination. Ann's right about the debt issue and the austerity bias that the IMF and the World Bank continue to perpetuate. Trade is a particularly pernicious. Trade has not really entered the climate debate in a big way yet, but it's going to have to. And it's a difficult issue because developing countries in the trade space, particularly in the WTO space, feel the hypocrisy of the advanced countries very, very viscerally. And the problem with that is that it's undermined trust in the system. So it's not only that the WTO is utterly ineffective now, thanks to Mr. Biden, well, thanks to Obama, actually. People forget about that. Obama was the first person not to appoint an appellate judge to the WTO. But that it's really undermined a feeling, a sense of trust, that developing countries don't trust advanced economies in the trade space. And we need more trust if we're going to address the kinds of combined problems that Amir has identified in the book. So, I think we worry obviously a lot about trade. I think policy space is back on. Policy space is back in the system. The system can't penalize anybody that infringes WTO rules. So the multilateral level, there is not a problem with policy space, technically. Now that does, of course, at the regional level, at the bilateral level, investor-state dispute settlement systems, these are problems still for developing countries. So there are other ways in which policy space is impeded. But I think the more pernicious part of that story is the lack of trust in the system that has been eroded with the behavior of advanced economies and is being perpetuated with the IRA and the CBAM and other approaches. So I think we need to focus a lot more on getting the international dimension right, because as Ann said, this is not a problem that countries can solve. Even big countries can solve by themselves. So we need multilateralism. Unfortunately, we don't have a multilateralism right now that is fit for purpose. So I'll leave it there. With that, on that optimistic note.
That's what we always expect from you, Richard, the optimism in the room.
Well, thank you. Thank you for touching upon so many interesting topics: jobs, state capacity, policy making. I like the local and global, so I thank your examples too. And also about talking that it's not only a global south, but also it transcends boundaries. And Richard, thank you for the candidness. I like having not only friendly comments, but constructive tensions. Before going forward, I wanted to share the floor with you, because I know there's a lot of people here with experience and interests. So before maybe allowing Amir to take the next conversation, because there were some provocations about the book, I'd like to open the floor for